evening. I'm Catharine Richert. You're listening to NPR News. Psychedelics can bring to mind the turn-on, tune-in, drop-out counterculture of the 1960s. But today, scientific opinion about drugs like LSD and psilocybin are starting to shift. Neuroscientists who've studied these drugs say they can be effective in treating bipolar disorder, depression, and addiction. And that research is getting noticed here in Minnesota. Legislators are considering a bill that would allow psilocybin, that is a psychedelic, to be used to treat addiction and severe mental illness. And if passed, the legislation would launch a trial to study the treatment. The bill is based off of recommendations from the state's Psychedelic Medicine Task Force report that was published last year. And this hour, we'll talk with two people who've been exploring the use of psychedelics to help people struggling with mental illness, about the science behind psychedelics, whether they're an effective form of treatment, and how likely they are to hit the mainstream. And we hope you'll call in with your questions, too. What do you want to know about psychedelic medicine or psychedelic therapy? What's been your experience with psychedelics? Call us at 651-227-6000 or 800-242-2828. Or if you're watching on our live stream, you can leave us a comment on Facebook or YouTube, and we will have our guests respond on the air. Now I want to introduce our guests. We have Jessica Nielson. She is the chairperson of the Psychedelic Medicine Task Force for the state of Minnesota. That's the group that made recommendations to the legislature. She has a doctorate in anatomy and neurobiology and researches psychedelic neuroscience and drug policy reform. She's also the founder and president of the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota. That's a community organization that promotes education, harm reduction, and community building around psychedelics. Great to have you with us, Jessica.
Thanks for having me.
And we also have Ismail Lauredo Ali. He is the co-executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. He is an attorney who's been involved in the drug policy reform movement for over a decade. He joins us tonight from Oakland, California. Thanks for being with us, Ismail.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
All right, Jessica, I want to start with you. Tell us a little bit more about this task force. What is it? Why was it formed in the first place?
Yeah, happy to. So the task force was created in 2023 by the legislature to basically convene a group of subject matter experts that were appointed both by the state as well as volunteers from the public to really do a thorough deep dive into whether expanding access to psychedelic medicines in Minnesota would be feasible, given that they are not FDA approved right now, and but other states are trying to legalize therapeutic access programs, and other states include Oregon and Colorado, and more recently New Mexico. And so the legislature really kind of noticed that, we are under a pretty intense mental health crisis in this country and also obviously in this state. And so we need more tools in the toolbox to help mental health professionals to treat these really hard to treat conditions like depression and post-traumatic stress disorder and substance use. So in 2023, the legislature approved the task force to be created, and then the governor appointed about 22 members. So these were members that were from state agencies like the Department of Health, the Department of Commerce, the Attorney General's office, the Department of Public Safety, the governor's office, as well as some appointees from the legislature. So they had a member from both the House and the Senate from both parties. And then there were people from the public that volunteered and then were reviewed and appointed by the governor based on their expertise. So this was there was a psychiatrist, a psychologist, an addiction medicine specialist, a public health expert, 2 patients with treatment-resistant mental health conditions, 2 veterans, and then myself as someone who has done clinical trials in the state with psilocybin, as sort of the person that had demonstrated experience giving people psychedelics in a clinical setting. And so we met over the course of 14 months online. We would have these 3-hour meetings on the first Monday of every month over the course of 14 months from November 2023 until December 2024. And from that, we produced a 200-page legislative report that we submitted to the legislature in January of 2025 with our recommendations for how to prop up a psychedelic medicine access program in the state. The work was really centered on 3 specific psychedelics that have been granted breakthrough therapy designation by the Food and Drug Administration, meaning they've been showing promise in clinical trials for treating conditions beyond what existing therapies can offer. And so those were LSD, MDMA, and psilocybin. psilocybin. And we really honed in more on psilocybin-containing mushrooms because they're a natural product.
And why is that? Okay,
Yeah.
it's a natural product.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
So it's kind of hard to source a synthetic. You obviously need a whole lab that's like got pharmaceutical best practices. They call it good manufacturing practices. But the fact that they're a Schedule I drug at the federal level makes that really tricky to source because all of the precursors you would need to synthesize these synthetic compounds would violate other federal laws. And one of the tasks for the task force was really trying to figure out how can we prop up a program in a state where we're fundamentally violating a federal law with the Controlled Substances Act and also the Food and Drug and Cosmetics Act for what FDA allows you to administer as medicines. So not adding additional layers of, invoking additional federal laws and violations of that by trying to mail precursors to different labs. So really with psilocybin mushrooms, similar to cannabis, we can grow that in the state and kind of regulate that ourselves while kind of recognizing ultimately we're in a violation of federal drug laws.
Okay, we'll come back to that. But I want to know a little bit more about, because this bill would set up a trial for psilocybin specifically, what do we know about how this drug actually works and what is actually happening in our brain when people take it? And how is it different from other drugs that people take to treat depression or, addiction otherwise?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the way that psilocybin works is it's able to induce this buzzword that's going around. It's kind of a hallmark thing in neuroscience called neuroplasticity. It's really just the brain's ability to change, and it can be induced from a variety of different things, including learning something new, exercise, exposure to novelty, and also exposure to psychedelics because they're able to kind of unlock the brain's ability to get into a very adaptive state where you can then sort of basically rewire what's going on under the hood to try to change some really stuck behaviors or beliefs that people might have. And the way that it's different from other known mental health treatments really is, they're both, so the common thing you would think of with depression is like antidepressants. So these are usually called SSRIs. So these are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That's kind of a jargony mouthful. What that means is you already have this molecule in your brain called serotonin that regulates a lot of basic brain functions, including your mood and your kind of overall state and just kind of how you operate and how your brain works. And so what SSRIs do, what antidepressants typically do that people can currently take is they just sort of make more of your own serotonin readily available in the brain so that it's able to use more of it. But we don't actually know how SSRIs work completely, and they're kind of prescribed for a whole host of things, and they don't always work for everybody, and they can have really bad side effects, and people will be on them for many, many, many years and not really see a good benefit, and then it can potentially be dangerous to get off of SSRIs. So what psychedelics like psilocybin do is they activate similar receptors in the brain that SSRIs are doing or that your own serotonin is doing, but it's a very distinct process that initiates this very intense hallucination, basically this altered state of consciousness that is just fundamentally different than the type of experience you would have by just having more serotonin in your brain. And so there's a lot of work being done in like animal models and cell culture, kind of like basic science to try to figure out how these things work, not only at the receptor level, but also what are they doing to change kind of some neural patterns in the brain. And then there's clinical trials that are looking more at like how can these compounds actually help people feel better from these really severe mental health conditions. So the science is constantly evolving, but we're learning that they are really good at being able to crack open the brain's ability to change so that you can get in there with some good therapeutic tools and try to like change somebody's stuck behaviors that they've struggled with for years.
Kind of like rewiring the brain a little bit, it sounds like.
Correct.
That's kind of, so your brain doesn't fall back into these patterns. Ismail, I want to bring you into the conversation here. Can you start out just by telling us a little bit more about the organization that you are executive director of? What do you do and what role does it play in your community?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And then I want to jump in to add a tiny bit to Jessica's fantastic answer there.
Sure.
First off, my name is Ismail Ali, and I'm the co-executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, another mouthful. We go by MAPS, the acronym, which is much easier for most people.
That's easy.
Much easier. The organization, this is actually our 40th year. We've been around since 1986. And the kind of core purpose of the organization is to create legal access to psychedelics for medical in medical, cultural, social contexts. And really the idea here is to focus on the beneficial use of psychedelics in responsible contexts, which can look like a lot of different things, which maybe we can get into in this conversation. But I think maybe my main role and placement within this conversation is that some of the flagship projects to create the kind of evidentiary models and also the therapeutic modality models for applying and delivering psychedelic assisted therapy or psychedelic assisted care to patients who are suffering with mental health disorders was work that some of my colleagues did starting in the early 2000s, really to figure out, well, what is this modality? And if we're going to be talking about, to Jessica's point, the potential benefit of these molecules, of these tools in the context of mental health, exactly how and what. And I think that I want to just add a couple of things to what Jessica shared. One thing that's really, really critical is this how piece. I think it's very interesting that the FDA doesn't require what's called mechanism of action. As long as it can be shown that something is safe and that it is effective, that is good enough. I mean, obviously, I'm being a little reductive here, but there's lots of drugs that are on the market that the FDA actually doesn't know, and I would say we as a body of scientific scholarly exploration don't actually know exactly how they work. The thing about psychedelics that's very interesting is, to Jessica's point, there's the mechanism of how they work with respect to serotonin and dopamine and kind of the neurotransmitters, which Jessica is much more qualified to speak about than I am. But one thing I want to add to it is this sort of element of the modality that goes along with it. One big difference between a lot of drugs, this is true for blood pressure, for SSRIs, for Tylenol, for whatever that is. You take the drug, it has a physiological effect on the body in some way, modulates something upward or downward or in some direction. And that alone causes the therapeutic benefit. And that's true with, the overwhelming majority of pharmaceutical drugs today. The thing that's interesting about psychedelics is that whereas with Tylenol, for example, I'm here at my desk in my home, I can take Tylenol here, I can take it in my car, I can take it at work. Tylenol's going to do the same thing no matter what. Where I am, no matter what, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to reliably have XYZ effect. Psychedelics are interesting because they actually have slightly different effects depending on the context, which is why, to Jessica's point, and also one of the interesting things about the bill that the Minnesota legislature is engaging with is like, what exactly is the context within which these substances can be delivered? Who gets to deliver them? Who gets trained? Who gets to have that, frankly, responsibility of taking care of a client or a patient who's going through, their severe mental health disorder, their whatever indication they're dealing with? How do we make sure that the use of psychedelics, the application of these substances, in this case, in the case of Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, of psilocybin, the active ingredient in, what people call magic mushrooms, quote unquote, how does that get developed? How does that get delivered responsibly so that the person who's going through whatever it is they're going through can have the maximum benefit? So in that sense, I would say one of the biggest differences, besides the fact that we're still understanding the physiological and biophysiological elements of it, is also this factor that how it happens really matters. And that's a big part of what that research is also looking at. What is the context? What does the therapy need to look like? What kind of training do the people need to have, and so on? And maybe Jessica can speak a bit more to what that looks like in the bill here. But that I just wanted to add that piece, because a lot of the work that I've done, that we've done at MAPS, is really establish that piece, which is like, what are these kind of cultural, social, medical containers within which the medicine gets delivered?
Well, Ismail, if you could tell us a little bit more about what that actually looks like. I mean, Minnesota wouldn't be the first state to implement some of this. I mean, have we learned anything from other states where this has been happening for longer?
Yeah, you guys totally get to claim at least one first, because every bill is a little bit different. And it's one of the situations where, because the paradigm of adult use, to Jessica's point, because the federal government right now, ostensibly, all of this is illegal under federal law. But like cannabis, they're allowing, you could say, states to go forward with different iterations of what legal access looks like. So in 2020, Oregon voters passed a bill, and in 2022, Colorado voters passed a bill, each that created what I like to call a kind of an adult use framework, which basically said if you're over the qualifying age, which I think in both states is 21, unless you have a contraindication, like a history of psychosis, or you're on certain medication that doesn't work with the psychedelics, then you're allowed to have a psychedelic experience under the auspices of this regulated system, right? Where you have trained facilitators who are using medicine that's been produced at licensed facilities. It's kind of a closed loop, and I won't go into this, but for legal reasons, to keep it legal within the state, to kind of the point that was made earlier, everything happens within the state, right? The cultivation, the manufacture, the distribution, it all happens within the state, which is what allows it to kind of fly under the radar, you could say, from a federal perspective. But to the question, like, what is the modality? The way that the states have operated, which is different from how the clinical trials have operated. The clinical trials have really responded to diagnosis. In the trials that we've done with MDMA, it's been responding to a PTSD diagnosis, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. So we're working with people with PTSD in that case. Clinical trials with psilocybin have looked at major depressive disorder and substance use disorder. There was a big study that just came out like a week ago, actually, on smoking cessation, a really, really landmark study, I would say.
I saw that.
One of the big areas that's been getting studied, right? It's like, and you know, people are trying to figure out how to quit smoking for eons since there was smoking. So it's like those are the kinds of things where even if we don't exactly know, although that study illuminated a lot, exactly how the application of psilocybin to someone's mind and makes them want to smoke less, like, we have certain mechanisms that we can point to. The thing that's very interesting is that it's the medicine in the context of these other therapeutic interventions, which maybe looks like talk therapy in the case of the MDMA therapy, where the clinicians are talking to the person while they're in it, and sometimes they're just having the experience and then supporting them afterward. Please.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're looking for the right combination for the person who's struggling that could involve the drug, but also the counseling as well. Excuse me.
Precisely.
And I want to just call out.
Precisely.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, that was it. It's exactly right. It's like, it's a little, it's a science, and you know, Jessica and she can really speak to this. It's a science, and it's also an art. It's like kind of, that's the thing about psychedelic therapy that I think is so interesting, that it's really this combination of the applied modality as well as the medicine itself. Yeah.
If you're just joining our conversation, we're talking about psychedelics tonight and their use in treating things like depression. We want to know what questions you have about psychedelic medicine, or if you've had an experience with psychedelics, we want to hear about it too. Call us at 651-227-6000 or 800-242-2828. And if you're watching our live stream, you can comment on Facebook or YouTube, and we will have our guests respond on the air. Jessica, going back to some of the clinical trials we've been talking about a little bit, how, you know, this bill would establish a trial for psilocybin. How would you envision that actually looking? Like, if I was participating, what might I experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do want to distinguish some terminology, because when we think of a trial, we think usually of like a clinical trial, which is one of these FDA-approved experiments that's trying to see, does this new drug perform better than some placebo or some other thing to help treat the condition, and should FDA approve it? What we're really talking about is a pilot program, which would be a limited rollout of a therapeutic access program where people who have one of these qualifying mental health or medical conditions that is showing promise in clinical trials that the task force reviewed would get an evaluation by a physician, a psychiatrist, for example, who would determine whether they in fact have the diagnosis, like depression or PTSD or a substance use disorder. And then they would also be evaluated and have some medical monitoring for whether they have, as Izzy was saying, there's some health conditions and medications that don't necessarily respond too well to things like psilocybin. So this would be a history of psychosis. There's some medications that people might be on that might not react well, or it might dampen the effect of psilocybin. There's also some cardiovascular risks for people that might have a pre-existing health condition, a cardiac condition. So it's really important that that's screened by a physician to make sure that they're both psychologically and medically safe to take the therapy. And then once that's determined, then the physician will recommend them to the program, and then the person can register with the regulatory agency that will monitor this program, and they'll get like a medical card, and they'll be enrolled in the program for a year. And then that will give them access to the supply of psilocybin that the state will also regulate in the form of psilocybin mushrooms. And then they'll be able to contact a licensed facilitator. So this will be a mental health professional, someone who's already treating mental health conditions like a LPCC or, a licensed marriage and family therapist or a social worker, or clinical psychologist, somebody who's already licensed by the state to provide mental health care, and they will receive additional training to do psilocybin facilitation. And there's programs that exist across the country for these other programs in Oregon and Colorado. And then once that happens, then folks can basically get access to the program, get access to the supply, and then they can set up their treatment session with their facilitator. And that will have kind of a three-pronged approach for a single treatment, which involves preparation and kind of getting comfortable with each other, because it's a very intimate experience to undergo one of these psilocybin experiences. And so making sure that there's a really good therapeutic relationship with the therapist and the facilitator that will be sitting there with them. And then they come in and do their psilocybin session, and then they'll come back a few days later to really process that, and kind of what Izzy was saying, really pairing that with some specific therapeutic modality that is probably best suited for whatever condition they have. So if they have depression, maybe doing something like acceptance and commitment therapy might make that much more effective than just doing it without psilocybin. Or if they have PTSD, there might be some trauma-specific therapy that they would then do. And the idea is that because psilocybin is able to unlock this brain's ability to change, then it's what's been shown in the clinical trials and also out in anecdotally out in the world from people using this, that it makes those therapeutic modalities much more effective and longer lasting.
Well, that was what I was going to ask. It sounds like it maybe changes the groundwork to be receptive to therapy that's already widely used and tried and true. Is that a fair assessment, Jessica?
Yeah, that's correct. And we're still trying to figure out what does that look like in terms of like other certain therapies that pair better with psilocybin. Is there a time window with which we could actually intervene where it's going to be more effective than if you waited, a few weeks or a few months? There's some really cool work happening in animals kind of showing that the duration of a psychedelic experience can sometimes predict how long we call it like a therapeutic window of opportunity is open, where then you could kind of really get in there and try to really change some of these stuck patterns that people haven't been able to change for years.
Yeah. All right. We already have some calls coming in. I want to get to Bob, who's in central Minnesota. Bob, what do you want to share with us?
I wanted to ask a question. I've heard that there may have been some scanning studies that show a difference in the pattern of integration of response to psilocybin between younger people, say in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and older people in their 60s or 70s.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. I'm going to ask Ismail that. Do you have any sense of whether there is a particular age where things might be more effective? Do we know anything about that?
Well, I really appreciate the question. And I guess, so from a clinical perspective, I don't know exactly the answer to that question. But what I can speak to is sort of twofold. One is what Jessica was saying, which is this window of whether it's like neuroplasticity or this window of opportunity. We know that children are more, their minds are more, I don't like the word plastic, but their minds are more malleable, right? Like generally speaking, there's a sense that young children are more absorbent. They're able. You see this with language acquisition. You see this with skills, all kinds of stuff. And what is interesting about this question is that there have been studies that show that the opportunity period after using psychedelics looks somewhat similar to the kind of mind state that a child might have. And I'm being super reductive here, right? But I do think that that's an interesting thing, because part of what the psychedelics may allow for is to kind of give your brain a moment in time where your brain's receptivity, its ability to change patterns, to interrupt habits, to try new things, psychologically and otherwise, looks more like what a younger person might have. Now, so that's one thing. And then the other thing I want to just mention, which I think is critical, is, and it kind of goes to your opening actually, where psychedelics were, a lot of people think about them, they think about the summer of love and these sort of associations, right? With really a lot of it is like youth culture or like college culture, or and that's really where psychedelics have been relegated in the last decades. And one of the interesting that's happening about this shift culturally, and this expansion of awareness of psychedelics and the research and the evidence base that's starting to come through, is that, and I'm really curious to see what the data shows over this next year, because after cannabis was legalized, a lot of teenagers, and my theory is that teenagers stopped thinking it was cool to break the rules. So teenage use actually stabilized or went down with cannabis, right? Right. And then for use for 65 and up increased. So now you have this group of elders who are actually benefiting from cannabis legalization because of all the different reasons. I think that we're going to see and have already started to see a similar trend with psychedelics. So to this question, whether or not there is more benefit, quote unquote, to utilizing psychedelics at a certain age range, what I do know is that there are more people that are old, that are further on in life, that are more in their elderhood, who are also either for the first time since the 60s or for the first time in their life re-experiencing it, because you've got people like Michael Pollan, who himself is an elder, who's writing about this stuff as an adult. So again, that's not a direct answer to the question, but these are kind of the themes and sort of the cultural trends that I'm seeing around that question that might be relevant.
Yeah, and I do
Jessica,
have
what about you? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a more scientific answer to that question. So I
Please.
think there's been this slide that I've actually shown in some of the talks I've given where I try to educate various audiences about psychedelics. And it was this scan that was done in people that were in their 20s versus people that were in their like 60s or 70s, showing how much serotonin receptors you actually have in your brain. And it was showing that as you get older, you actually have less and less serotonin receptors in your brain. And this could be linked to people having less cognitive flexibility, and really just kind of like seeing the dampening of like cognitive function that could be related to that. So all that's to say that just folks that are older might need more psilocybin to actually get the experience. But also we're seeing that, as Izzy was saying, that sometimes these experiences can revert the brain to what's called a critical period of development, which is the period of development when your brain's really absorbing everything like a sponge. And so it really is able to neurologically revert things back to that state. And it could be possible that it's sort of reinvigorating brains of all ages to be able to be in that same type of state to incorporate new information and change fundamental patterns.
Yeah. Rachel in St. Louis Park is calling in. Rachel, what do you want to share?
Hi. Yes. First, I want to say I'm a registered nurse who struggles with depression and anxiety. And I just want to say, hurry up. But my question is, are there any applications toward preventing or slowing the progression of dementia?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So there are some studies at Johns Hopkins looking at this. I don't know that they've produced enough data. But I think the idea is, like, as I was saying, if it's able to make the brain revert to this like younger state where things are a little bit more malleable, it might be able to do that. But I think the science is still pending on that. But it is something that's actively being explored.
If I could add two more quick things.
Yeah.
Sorry, go for it.
Go ahead, Ismail. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So the one thing that I'll just add is that similar to the studies that Jessica was just mentioning, there's also some research that's also, I think, in early stages, probably likely hasn't produced sufficient data to really draw any conclusions from either, but around inflammation. And as we know, dementia can be caused by a number of different factors. And if I'm not mistaken, there's the science is still unclear on what exactly different kinds of dementia is caused by and so on. So I think that there's both the research that's specifically on point that Jessica was just talking about, and then also research that's adjacent that's about inflammation and these kind of other processes within the body that have either like direct physical or psychosomatic impacts that may also have downstream effects like dementia, that I'm really looking forward to seeing what the body of what this research kind of starts to point to over the next few years. We've really focused a lot on the acute mental health illnesses, and I think that this is sort of another edge, another front. I don't love using the word frontier, but certainly another kind of horizon of how psychedelics may impact people's lives and well-being and so on. And I also want to put in a quick plug for Open Nurses, the Organization of Psychedelic and Entheogenic Nurses, OPEN Nurses. For you and other colleagues of yours who might be interested, they're an awesome organization that's working to educate nurses specifically who are going to be very, very, very much involved in the application of this care. So just wanted to add that as well.
We have Peggy from Jordan on the line. Peggy, what do you want to share with us?
Well, hi. I think psychedelics saved my life. And I would say, as a youth, as a young person, I was going through just a terrible crisis. I was suspended and kicked out of school several years in a row. I kept trying different schools and I was just a mess. And so through the use of LSD on just my own, wasn't in a program, obviously, it really gave me control of my mind. And I think, for one thing, you have to be able to hang on to your mind when you're under the influence. So there's a certain kind of a strength that is learned through that experience. And I just acquired a vision of myself and of my life, and it was a way of agency. It just created a discovery and a mastery of my own mind, and I realized how much choice we have and how important our thoughts are. And I didn't continue to be a druggie after that. It didn't ruin my life. I don't drink or smoke now.
Oh, so Peggy, this is so interesting, Peggy. So it actually helped you step away from drug use. You used this drug to step away from drug use?
Trouble, yes, because part of my trouble did involve drug use. I mean, it just turned me around. It completely turned me around.
Peggy, how old were you? At the time?
Okay. I was in my teens.
Oh, okay.
So,
okay.
Yeah, I was in my teens, but it was a really wonderful thing, and I would wish it for most people. I really think it was just like nothing else. I was in therapy at the time, and I did not make the progress in the therapy that I made just through what you have to do with your own mind and what you learn you can do.
Peggy, I want to give Ismail a chance to respond to that. When you hear Peggy's story, what do you hear that resonates with you?
I hear my story, honestly.
Say more.
My story is very, very similar. I really appreciate, Peggy, you sharing. I guess what I'll say is it's just to go to what you were just saying also, like, it's kind of mind-blowing when people hear, wait a minute, you did a drug and that made it so you don't do other drugs. Like, it's similar with the smoking thing, or you see this with alcoholism a lot. People who are struggling with alcoholism often can have like one psychedelic experience, and it really makes it easier for them to mitigate their use or even stop entirely. And I guess what strikes me about that story is that there's so many like that, and it took years and years of the sort of anecdotal evidence, these stories that people would share with their friends or their colleagues or your cousins or whoever, to put us to a point where we can actually build out the evidence base. And I like to be mindful, because people hear stories like this and they can get really excited, and people are also very desperate. They're suffering from a lot of different things, and I always want to urge caution, like, not that isn't an inspiring and important story, because it really is. Again, like, that was me as a teenager. I got suspended from schools. I was getting in trouble. I credit psychedelics also with my own personal, and I don't always reveal this, but it's also part of my story. And I think that I guess what I'm trying to say here is that it's really important to, above all, besides like just the potential of the modality itself, which I think is substantial, it's also just important to remind people that when we feel like our brains are broken, that like a bone, that it too can be set and healed. I think that for a long time we have this idea, it's like, oh, if I break my bone, got the technology, I can set it, I'm going to be okay in 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 10 weeks or whatever. But we have this idea in the modern kind of mental health paradigm that your brain, once it hits a certain state, it's there forever. And I think that's the real important takeaway here, which that if psychedelics do have this immense mental health potential, it's there. It's to, as Jessica was saying, it's to open up a critical period, which allows us to reorient, to get some perspective about what the heck is going on in our lives. And then through our own knowing, right? It's our own knowing of like what's right for us. It's not like a voice comes down. I mean, maybe sometimes you hear it, but it's not like, it's not religion, right? Like it's right. And sometimes it's very spiritual and so on. And people have deeply spiritual experiences, myself included. But I say that to say that it's like, it's you and your own alignments. You know what's best for yourself in your heart. And psychedelics can kind of help clear the trailheads to point in that direction. And I'm getting a little poetic, sorry, but yeah.
Well, no, I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, Jessica, it sounds like you've had some experiences using psychedelics too. Are you willing to share your personal experience?
Yeah, happy to. I started doing psychedelics when I was in high school, more kind of like experimenting. I did LSD when I was in high school, and then when I was in college, I moved on to magic mushrooms and MDMA. And when I was at that young age, it wasn't as impactful for me. I just don't think I had enough life experience to really have something as groundbreaking as what I've had since then. When I was in graduate school, I actually took a trip to Amsterdam to take magic mushrooms where they were legal and had my first kind of mystical experience. I was an atheist up until that point. It actually really changed my perspective on religion and spirituality. And then fast forward to just in the last couple of years, I've been struggling with infertility and have had quite a few miscarriages over the last several years. And that caused a deep, deep depression. And I actually had to go on medical leave because I was just really distraught, and I was in and out of therapy, and nothing was really working to help with my depression and grief around all of that. And so I did a big dose of magic mushrooms by myself. I don't necessarily recommend that, but that's how I prefer to do it. And was able to really kind of reconnect with myself, my sense of purpose. And it just kind of helped me get more energy and motivation to not give up and to fight for myself and for the causes that I care about, including this one, and really wanting to make this accessible to more people because it saved my life, and I've seen it save so many other people's lives. But I've had a very long relationship with psychedelics that has evolved over my life based on how I've, interacted with them, first recreationally, then spiritually, then professionally, and then therapeutically.
Yeah. I want to get to Kathy now in St. Paul. Kathy, what do you want to share?
Hi, I'm 75 years old, and when I was a youngster, I did use marijuana, and several times I did have hallucinations from it. I do have major depression and have been suffering from it since I was 17, and I'm now 75. And I'm really desperate to get some help. Medication doesn't seem to be helping me. I'm wondering if psilocybin would be a good alternative for me. And how well does it work with the major depression?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I really appreciate you sharing your story, and I'm sorry that you've struggled so much with finding a good therapy. This isn't medical advice by any means, but the clinical trials right now with psilocybin are currently in phase 3, and they're about to finish phase 3 clinical trials. What that means is that that's the last stage that the FDA requires before they'll allow a company that's trying to bring a new therapy to market to get it approved by the FDA. So there's been very promising evidence for treatment-resistant depression specifically, and we could potentially see FDA approval coming soon. Obviously, there's state programs like the ones in Oregon and Colorado and hopefully here in Minnesota that would provide access kind of ahead of that context. But I think so far the results are suggesting that it's useful for treatment-resistant depression, but that's really a very personal decision on whether it will work, what's the context that the treatment will be delivered, and is it something that is appropriate. So I think it's definitely something to explore and ask more questions about, but the decision whether to take it really is a very personal one and depends on the context with which it will be taken.
We have Sandra in Minneapolis on the line. Sandra, what do you want to share?
Hi. I just want to say for context, I'm a mental health professional, but the thing I'm going to bring up is personal. My older sister used LSD when she was in college and had a complete psychotic break and spent the rest of her life as a schizophrenic, with most of that time being pretty far from reality, or with having breaks in reality that she managed to maneuver around. So I understand the excitement that everybody's having and the interest, and I think it's a good thing. But I do get concerned that there's a very real possibilities for very damaging things to happen for people. And I don't hear enough about that to make me feel like I can recommend it to people,
Yeah. Sandra, I appreciate you calling because we had not talked about the risks yet, and I really wanted to get to this. And I want to give both our guests a chance to respond. Jessica, I'll start with you. What are the risks? I mean, it seems like, there are lots of stories like Sandra's sister.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important because I think in the media hype around psychedelics, a lot of people think of it as this magic bullet cure that's going to fix everything. And yeah, it's not. It's a very intense experience, and the predisposition for psychosis is something that's a known risk factor. I would say that the evidence and the scientific research around things like LSD and psilocybin have shown that they're not causing psychosis in people that don't already have a vulnerability. But for those that do, it is something that needs to have a lot of careful screening. And oftentimes, folks that have that kind of history or predisposition are excluded from the clinical trials or not recommended for some of these state regulated programs for that reason, because there is kind of this aspect of reality monitoring that can get really confusing if people are already struggling with that, with a predisposition to psychotic symptoms. So I do just want to name that, as well as there are some cardiovascular risks if folks have, uncontrolled hypertension or cardiovascular disease. Psychedelics like psilocybin do increase blood pressure and heart rate, so there are some risks associated with that, but only if there's a vulnerability there. And obviously, there's just like these really intense psychological experiences that can bring up things that people may not be prepared to handle, which is why the context that these people take this type of therapy is really important, that they do have the appropriate support and they're with somebody who's actually trained to deal with something really intense that might come up if and when that does happen. Because, a lot of people will say they had a very, very challenging or difficult psychedelic experience, but that it ultimately ended up being one of the most rewarding experiences of their lives. But you do have to get through that difficult aspect, and it can be very hard to navigate some of these experiences.
Right. And so you're talking about that screening being so important, right? When you are just using these drugs on your own, there's no screening involved. You might not know that you're predisposed to psychosis, for instance. Ismail, say more about this. This is a good point that Sandra's making here.
I'm really glad. Thank you, Sandra, for sharing, and I'm sorry about your sister. And I think first thing I would say is to echo what was just shared around the predisposition. And there's a bunch of studies that are similar on cannabis and schizophrenia and so on, where it's we're trying to figure out, is there a relationship between these two pieces? And to Jessica's point, the science hasn't directly kind of shown a causative element, but part of the reason that screening piece is so important is because we know that if you have a predisposition to any one of these, it could increase the risk, whether it's because of a psychological destabilization or something else. So I guess what I want to say here is, from my perspective as a person who really has tried to build out this advocacy base, the answer is we're really, and I think this is one of those big misconceptions to really clarify for listeners or for people who are just trying to understand this. We are in an environment of an immense mental health crisis, so there is a lot of desperation and people are seeking something. There haven't been new psychological interventions, psychiatric interventions since SSRIs, which we're talking 30, 40 plus years. So there's an immense amount of desperation, which kind of lends itself to this sort of hype, this sort of silver bullet effect. And I think it's really important for us and for places like this radio show, for conversations like this, to tell that whole story, not to be evangelists because this is super exciting and because there's all this potential. I think that is true, but also because the reason we're taking the time, the reason that the task force that you guys published something, Jessica, that was 200, 300 pages, is because it's not just a silver bullet effect where you take the drug and boom, bam, you're good. You're right. It's there's all of these layers of things that actually really do matter from a clinical perspective. So I say that to say that I hope that what we're moving toward, both in the state of Minnesota and also generally within this field and within this movement, is a responsible understanding of what beneficial use actually looks like. What does it look like to have the appropriate clinical support? What does it look like for when someone goes back home after a huge experience that might have changed their spiritual paradigm or changed their understanding of themselves? What happens when they go back home, and how do they know that the people around them understand them enough just to support whatever budding version of themselves comes next? I don't want to get too esoteric here, but it really, that container really, really does matter. So I think that that's maybe the main point here, which is that these substances absolutely come with risks. Like so many other things that we do, we allow a certain level of risk within society. And the question isn't binary, do we do it or not because there's risk, but rather, how do we know that when we're bringing these powerful tools forward, for example, with this pilot program that's being proposed in the legislature in the state of Minnesota, what are the mechanisms that allow for that type of thing, that type of outcome to be as the likelihood of that to be as low as possible? How do we make sure that the risks are as mitigated as possible? We bring in all of the science and all the evidence that we have to show that the people who really can benefit, because there's so many stories of people who are treating their PTSD, who are transforming their depression and so on, kind of to the earlier question. And sometimes it does happen kind of like offhand, but more often it's because they have that container and they have that support. And that really is the key thing. And that's really where I would say the edge of the science is. How do we make sure that that container is as responsibly crafted as possible?
Right on. Okay, so we have John on YouTube who's been watching the live feed, and he wrote, microdosing is likely the key. I am very curious to know if we know anything about microdosing. I mean, we hear about people microdosing, for instance, GLP-1s. It feels like it's sort of a jargony, term that people are throwing around a lot. So microdosing, Jessica, what do we know? And also, do we know, if someone starts down this type of therapy, down this path, how long must they actually continue to do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think microdosing has gained a lot of popularity because it's an ability to take a very small amount of the drug without really feeling the intense effects of it. And I will say from a scientific perspective, the clinical trials that have been done with kind of placebo controls have shown that microdosing is really no better than a placebo effect. But as a neuroscientist, I'm fascinated by the placebo effect because that's just saying your brain can basically feel better just because you believe it can. Yeah. And I think that's amazing. And so, but I think functionally, it reminds me of like it's supplementing an SSRI with, taking a small dose of a psychedelic on, a couple times a week. Usually when people do microdosing, they're taking it, maybe 3 days in a row or 3 days on, 3 days off. There's different protocols that people do, and people swear by it, and they swear that they get better. And I think there's something to that, and I don't want to discount that. But from a scientific perspective, it hasn't been shown to be any better than placebo. But again, if people are feeling better, I think that's amazing.
I want to go now to Dustin and Red Wing. We have a few minutes left here. Dustin, what do you want to share with us?
Yes, my question is for Ismail. Talking about the legal repercussions of a treatment, will all parties involved have shared responsibility, or will the patient be given a waiver saying they agree that this is experimental medicine and they fully accept the consequences?
Great question, Ismail.
It is a good question, and just as was just shared, this is I'm not offering legal advice or any sort of like legal opinion about a specific situation, but and it's actually going to be dependent on a few different factors. So. Generally speaking, there's a process of, informed consent, which may or may not include a waiver of responsibility of some kind. It's going to be different on a case-by-case basis, and in a place where you have, let's say, a new professional class. So like, for example, in Oregon and Colorado, you have a system where there's a new class being created of facilitators who are being trained specifically in this modality. Sometimes they're dual licensed, they're also social workers or so on. In the bill in Minnesota, you're not creating a new class, right? You're working with, as Jessica was sharing earlier, there is there's an application that's permitted for existing licensees, right? So my estimation is that what you see in other therapeutic or other psychological modalities, that you have a similar balance there. I'm sure that as long as anything is in sort of a innovative treatment or experimental treatment phase, there's obviously the risk calculus is a little bit different. Once the FDA approves, if it were to approve any of these modalities, you'd be in a different paradigm, right? Then it would be treated a little bit more like a pharmaceutical drug. Now, just because something's been approved by the FDA doesn't mean that the patient takes on no responsibility, or the company doesn't either. So I'm not really giving a straight answer, because I think it's really going to depend on the construction of responsibility in that given jurisdiction. And until we have more evidence and more kind of buy-in from some of these either state or federal agencies that are, once you go beyond the pilot project into the way that any other drug might be treated or any other modality might be treated, you may see it kind of treated in a more kind of standard way. But for now, this question, I would say the primary frontline threshold here is informed consent, which is like, do people know what they're getting can they, how much can they know about something that's going to have a psychological impact? I don't know, Jessica, if you have a comment on the way that.
Jessica, I'm wondering if.
But yeah.
Well, Jessica, does the legislation that's being considered here in Minnesota build in any language that would detail how this would all work legally?
Yeah, I think that's something that would probably need to get worked out in committee. We do have, provisions for the fact that because we're starting with licensed mental health professionals, they already have oversight and accountability through the health licensing boards. So like when a patient comes in and wants to do ketamine, there's a whole process of what's to be expected, what are the risks. There's an informed consent to treatment. You get this also when you're getting surgery, and it's not that it makes it so that the provider isn't liable for something if they harm you. It's just that just because you're engaging in the therapy and it doesn't go the way you want, then that's not something that's actionable. But if the provider does something genuinely harmful to the client, then they're not going to be absolved of consequences, even if they're doing something that's quasi-experimental.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that's the key thing about a program like what's being proposed in Minnesota is that it's not starting from scratch, right? It's building out from the existing infrastructure, responding to the recommendations that are made by the task force. So that's a key thing is in some states you're seeing something built more or less from scratch, and there's a lot of amazing learning happening there too. But I just want to differentiate those two kind of worldies. Yeah. Sorry, go for it.
No, that's okay. Actually, our time is up for tonight. I want to thank both of our guests. We have Jessica Nielson. She is the chairperson of the Psychedelic Medicine Task Force for the state of Minnesota. She also researches psychedelic neuroscience and drug policy reform. And we had Ismail Lauredo Ali. He is the co-executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. He is an attorney who's been involved in the drug policy reform movement for over a decade. This conversation was produced by Carrie Dwyer. Tomorrow night at 8, we're going to have a discussion on how AI can change the way we work in the jobs of the future. Will technology make us more productive? Will it free us up to be more creative? Or are our jobs on the line? Join us tomorrow to find out. Thanks for listening and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Support for tonight's program comes from Alight and Northwest Minnesota Foundation, helping create a trusted space where Minnesotans can come together, engage with one another, and better understand the issues shaping our communities. We're grateful for their support of thoughtful civic dialogue and connection. Thanks for being with us tonight.